welcome back to the Panic Room, everyone, and to another episode of Pax's Little Library of Horrors. So get your tissues out, everybody. We're gonna cry today. Maybe not, but it is a sad book today. And a messed up one. Like, why you would put a child through this is beyond me. Today, we are talking about The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. And this is by Kate DiCamillo. Yeah, so it is too thick to read, but it isn't a ton on each page, and you do have some illustrations. Boy, do you have some illustrations. Not anything like Strull Peter, let's put it that way. To me, they are disturbing, especially when they go hand in hand with the story. So let's dive in. We have a rabbit by the name of Edward, and he is a China rabbit. And he is the property of a little girl by the name of Abilene. And he was given to Abilene by her grandmother, who is described as being kind of witch-like. Right off, you see that Edward is kind of full of himself. Like, he has, special, leather shoes and special clothes, and he likes his ears just so, things like that. And Abilene treats him like he's a person, talking about how, she sits him up to look out the window so he can watch when she comes home from school, things like that. And he recounts these times where, for example, a dog got into the house and grabbed him, and how, he was just humiliated. Or the maid picked him up and put him with the other dolls of Abilene, and he doesn't like being called a doll. He's a rabbit, not a bunny, not a doll. He's a rabbit. So he kind of comes off as unlikable. I thought this was going to be like a cautionary tale about being a giant piece of shit and how you shouldn't do that. And it sort of is, but not really. So the story goes that Abilene and her parents are going to go, because I'm assuming this is back in the 1800s. It doesn't say. But they're going to go by ship to London. And while on the ship, Abilene is out on the deck with Edward in his little swimsuit. No, I'm not lying. He has outfit changes. And these two boys pick Edward up, as boys are wont to do. They're teasing Abilene, and they start tossing him. Well, of course, Edward goes overboard. But then it talks about him sinking, and you get this, it's kind of very bleak for a children's book. You get these descriptions of him laying on the ocean floor. And a couple times in the book, it will tell you how long he was at a certain place. He was on the ocean floor for almost a year, 260 some days, I think it was. And he was talking about how, he couldn't see the stars and how it was so black. And I don't know, it sort of started giving me these weird creepy vibes. Wow, that's a little much for a kid's book, talking about how you can't hear anything and you can't see anything. And he starts thinking about how good he had it with Abilene. And before they left on this little trip, the grandmother tells Edward, the doll, the rabbit, the inanimate object, tells Edward that she's disappointed in him. So then, as the reader, you're thinking okay, did the grandmother enchant this rabbit, to protect her granddaughter? And you don't find out. By the way, spoiler, you don't find out. So now that Edward's laying on the ocean floor, thinking all these thoughts about how, he thought maybe he did have it good, even when the dog got him, or even when the maid picked him up, you start as the reader to wonder okay, I guess we're going to find this whole journey with Edward, and he's going to come out a better rabbit, right? And I'm assuming he was going to find his way back to Abilene. But this journey, I said in my found book review, I'll link it up here somewhere, that there's a name for this, bleak horror. This horror that just makes you feel hollow. This book has a little bit of that. Granted, it's not to the level of a horror book, obviously, because this is a kid's book, but it has that. It has that bleakness, that just lonesome feeling, It really does. It does that real well. So a storm comes up while Edward's on the ocean floor, starts whipping him around. He gets thrown up, and it talks about how he's so joyful to see the sky again after a year. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's me because I don't really do water, but does anyone else can you imagine being in the darkness of the ocean, not needing to breathe because you're a toy, and just for almost a year, face down in the sand because you can't move because you're a toy? that just did something to me. I got like a twinge thinking about that, you know? And again, maybe it's me because I don't deal with water real well, but so he gets caught up in a fishing net. And this, of course, this fisherman picks him up and is like, wow, look, it's a rabbit. I'll take him home to my wife. And they're a little old couple. So he gets taken home to the wife, who you find out has 2 adult children. But she had a 3rd kid who died when he was like 5 years old. Robert, I believe his name was. And she starts like knitting dresses for the rabbit, Edward. And she calls him Savannah. And Edward's like taken aback at this. You know, he's like, I am not Savannah, I'm Edward, I want my leather shoes, blah, 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 blah. So she starts to like set him up in the kitchen and she tells him all this stuff. Like she talks to him while her husband is out being a fisherman. And you come to find out that slowly he starts to like love her, like listen to her and be invested in these stories. And then like the fisherman will come home and put him on his shoulder and go out to smoke his little corncob pipe and talk to him and stuff. And it slowly dawns on you as the reader that this little old couple has replaced their dead son with this rabbit. Yeah, kind of sad, isn't it? It gets worse. So the adult daughter, Lolly, I believe her name was, comes back to visit. And apparently the town has noticed that this little sweet old couple has taken this rabbit in and is treating it like a child. And she's like, oh, I'm going to break them of this. Throws him away. Not only throws him away, takes his ass to the dump and like puts trash on him so that her parents can't like get him out of the trash. No, she takes him to the dump. What a complete and utter waste of a human being. Why would you do that? That is so sad. And it was talking about how like the little old woman was like crying because she didn't know where Edward went. Well, Savannah. And it gets even worse. Okay? Like every time you're like, wow, that's really sad. And then the next leg of Edward's journey, it's like, Mother of God. Why? Why is this a kid's book? So Edward lays in the trash for like, I think it said 160 days. So almost what, like not quite half a year. And he's talking about how like it stinks. But, you know, he can't do anything about it because, you know, all he can do is, like, lay there because he's a toy. And it's talking about how, like, he's feeling this weird emotion and he realizes that he misses his former owners, like the little girl Abilene and now the little old couple. Yeah, he's starting to miss them. So he's laying there thinking this because you get a little bit of, like, inner dialogue in between these horrific stories. So this dog comes and digs him out, right? Takes him back to this, what the book calls a hobo, who is riding the rails. And Edward spends 7 years with him. The guy calls him Malone. So now it's no longer Edward, it's no longer Savannah, now he's Malone. And he talks about like how they ride the rails together, they sleep in the cars together, they'll gather around with other hobos, and like Bull, the hobo guy, will tell stories, and you know, and yeah, and how he'll like share food with the dog. And then buckle your seatbelts. So then the hobo is sleeping in a train car one night, and I guess like the little night watchman or whatever comes along and sees him and is like, oh, not on my watch, kicks the dog. So right off I was like, I'm gonna put this book down. I don't deal well with like abusive animals. I don't. So he kicks the dog and they start to scuffle and he like tosses Malone, Edward, out, and Edward rolls down this hill, right? So it is kind of implied, because you hear like screaming coming from the train car, it's kind of implied that this guy beat the shit out of this hobo and or possibly killed the dog. At least it was to me. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but still, it was a lot. It was a lot for a kid's book. So here Edward's rolled down the hill and you're thinking, okay, it cannot get worse than this. Here comes this little old woman, picks him up. So this little old woman is like, I'm gonna put you in my garden to scare the crows away. Okay, and then we get this horrible, like, description of Edward getting nailed to these boards. It's very, like, crucifixion kind of style. Not gonna lie, like, talking about, like, putting nails through his ears and stuff. At least that's what it put me in mind of. He's talking about sitting in the middle of this field and how the crows are like pecking at him and stuff, and how, you know, he wishes that he had wings because then he could fly back to Abilene or his little old couple or go check on the hobo. And it's awful. He starts to get very bleak thinking about like how he wished that, you know, they would just like pluck his eyes out, and how, you know, he wished he could fly away, but he can't because he's a toy and he can't do anything without someone moving him. And so guys, let me show you this. All right, I'm going to read you the little passage of like the internal monologue that Edward's doing while he's up here on his cross. Yeah. And these are like the little tin pie plates to scare the birds away. Yeah. So yeah, we have that. And so he's like looking at the stars, right? Because that's kind of his thing through the whole book. Like he really likes to look at stars. Finally, the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars, but for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. You are down there alone, the stars seemed to say to him, and we are up here in our constellations together. I have been loved, Edward told the stars. So, said the stars, what difference does that make when you're all alone now? Edward could think of no answer to that question. Eventually, the sky lightened, and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned, and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her. I have been loved. Does that not make you think back to your own childhood and the toys you had and the toys you loved? Like, it hit me in all parts of the feels when I read that. That's awfully powerful to me for a book, especially when the rabbit is literally like on a cross. So then we get the next leg of our story. And if you didn't think it could get worse, it does. So this little boy comes to help the old woman with her garden, and he's eyeing Edward the whole time. And he whispers to Edward, I'm going to come back for you tonight. And you're like, oh great. All right, this boy's probably going to rip him apart? You know, what else could happen to this poor rabbit? So the boy comes, takes him down. He's like, I'm going to take you back to my sister. Let me read you the rest of that statement. I come to get you for Sarah Ruth, Bryce said. You don't know Sarah Ruth, but she's my sister. She's sick. She had a baby doll made out of china. She loved that baby doll, but he broke it. He broke it. He was drunk and stepped on that baby's head and smashed it to 100 million pieces. Them pieces was so small, I couldn't make them go back together. I tried and tried, but I couldn't. Yeah, so now we have a sick kid whose dad is an alcoholic and, like, crushes your baby dolls. Yeah, that's what we have here. So it's never said, but the little girl seems to have, like, tuberculosis or something along those lines because she's coughing a lot. She can barely speak. She can't breathe really well. And then it starts talking about how, like, the brother's the only one that'll bring food home for her. And at one point, like, the brother is playing harmonica for her, and he ties a bunch of, like, string to Edward and makes Edward dance like a marionette for her just to make her laugh. And it doesn't end well because after, like, an unspecified amount of time, the little girl passes away. The boy gets in a fight with the dad because the dad starts to cry, and the little boy, you know, after all of this abuse from his alcoholic father, is saying, like, you never loved her, you didn't take care of her. So the man, like, tosses the son out, who, I don't know, might be 8 or 9 at this point, and they end up on the streets of, like, Nashville, I think it was. The little boy's playing his harmonica and making Edward dance, like trying to get change in a hat. You've seen that. You've seen those tropes, like people playing guitar and stuff, and you put, like, change in a hat. That's what they're doing. Then, it's the end of the day. You know, the boy's like, oh, we have enough money for some food. So they go into this diner, and the boy is, like, starving, right? So he eats all this food. The bill comes, and he doesn't have enough to pay. So the waitress is like, you're going to take it up with the owner. The owner comes out and is like, why can't you pay me? You know, like, just really starts, like, hammering this kid, right? And he's like, well, but, you know, maybe I can play my harmonica and, you know, my rabbit can dance for you. And so the cook is like, I don't need your stinking rabbit, and takes him, and he smashes Edward. But listen to this, because the story's being told from Edward's point of view, right? So listen to how this, like, happens to Edward. So Neil is the owner. Neil stared at Bryce, and then without warning, he reached down and grabbed hold of Edward. This is what I think of dancing rabbits, says Neil, and he swung Edward by the feet, swung him so that his head hit the edge of the counter hard. There was a loud crack. Bryce screamed, and the world, Edward's world, went black. So you would think that's the end of the story, right? No, it can't be that easy. So Edward goes to what I can only assume is, like, doll heaven, because he sees, like, all the people that he's loved, like the hobo and the little old couple and all this. They're all there, like, waiting for him, and he can walk and move on his own. but the little girl, Sarah Ruth, the one that passed away, isn't there. And he looks up and he's like, oh, she's in the stars. So he starts to fly, because he's talked about like the crows, how he wanted to fly like the crows. So he starts to fly up there, and they're like, no, Edward, come back, come back. And he's like, no, I've got to go to Sarah Ruth. She needs me. And then he wakes up in this doll maker shop. Come to find out, Bryce found the doll maker wanting to get Edward fixed, but he couldn't afford it. So the doll maker offers him a deal. He says that he'll fix Edward, but then he gets to keep him and sell him for a profit. So then we get this absolutely heartbreaking scene where Edward's fixed and Bryce comes back in to visit him, and the doll maker's all like, no, you can't be coming back in here. He's mine now. We made a deal, boy. And the boy's like, I just want to see him one more time. He's like, all right, one more time. You can see him, and then you gotta leave and never come back. I'm like, what kind of person are you? The kid's not hurting anything. He wasn't even touching it. He just wanted to see him. So then he sticks Edward on the shelf with all these dolls. Now you remember, Edward didn't like dolls, right? So these dolls are like, who's gonna buy you? You're a rabbit. This is a doll place. Nobody's gonna want you. So sure enough, we get this little like montage of these dolls, you know, that were sitting next to him on the shelf getting bought, and Edward's never bought. But at this point, Edward doesn't care. He really doesn't. Like, he's done. He was like, you know, every time I love somebody, they always leave me, or something bad happens, so I'm fine. I'm just gonna sit here and collect dust. I don't need anybody. You know, so it's like, wow, to hear a rabbit in a kid's book talk like this. Like, I don't need a kid. I don't need to be loved. You know, love sucks. Everything that happened to me is terrible, and, you know, it all started because somebody wanted to love me. You know, stuff like that. It's very, to me, very dark. So then, this little girl comes in and is looking, and you hear a mom in the background and is like, oh, we're not going to buy anything today. We're just looking. And so she stops in front of Edward, and she's looking at him, and he's like, indifferent at this point. She picks Edward up and she's like, oh, but Mom, look, it's a rabbit. It's a China rabbit. You know how kids are. And Edward looks up, and around the mom's neck is a tiny little like locket looking thing, except it's not a locket. It's a little pocket watch that Edward recognizes as one of his pocket watches off of one of his like really well-made clothes back when he was living with the little girl Abilene, and he was all like high and mighty. Yeah. It's Abilene. It's the 7-year-old that, you know, he left so many years ago. It's her daughter that is holding him. And the book ends with essentially Abilene going, Edward? Cut to black. So it is kind of a cool ending, but boy, you know, it's not lying when it calls the book a journey. It really is. And it is one hell of a journey. Like, there are points in this book where I was just like, what in the hell can they put this rabbit through next? Even though we have read some really messed up kids' books, I have to say, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane has to be probably one of the most bleakest, and it left me, largely, with a feeling of loneliness. Yeah, it had a happy ending, but hell, that journey, I feel like your kid would have probably had nightmares at some points, you know, just because of the feeling it gives you. You know, not necessarily the story itself at some points even, but the feeling it gives you of just like this utter aloneness that Edward felt, you know, and his bitterness over the things he had been through. So guys, what do you think about the journey of Edward Tulane? Does it sound bleak to you? Because boy, it was to me. And I think this is our first book about a rabbit, isn't it? So guys, thank you so much for coming back to Pax's Little Library of Horrors. Please, if you like this, hit like, subscribe. It would really help me out. And until next time, class dismissed.